The blizzard's call. The storm raged with a ferocity that made the world seem otherworldly. Snow whipped across the desolate highway, forming ghostly spirals that danced and disappeared into the night. The horizon was a blur, swallowed by the relentless whiteout, and the sound of the wind howling like a restless beast echoed through the emptiness. In the middle of this chaos stood a little girl, no more than 8 years old. She was a tiny figure cloaked in a tattered red coat, its edges frayed and barely enough to shield her from the icy bite of the storm. Her hair, dark and damp, clung to her face as her wide, tear-filled eyes scanned the passing cars. She waved her arms, her small voice struggling to rise above the deafening gale. "Help, please stop. Someone, please," she cried, her breath visible in the freezing air. The highway remained a stream of indifference. Vehicles sped by, their headlights cutting through the storm but not slowing. Drivers glanced at the odd sight, a child alone in such treacherous weather, but dismissed it as a trick of the storm or a situation best left unaddressed. Fear and skepticism clouded their judgment. The world moved on, cold and unyielding. The girl didn't waver. Her desperation kept her rooted to the spot, even as her fingers turned numb and her legs trembled. A car approached, its headlights barely piercing the dense snowfall. For a moment, it seemed as if it would pass like the others. But then, its brake lights flared, and the vehicle skidded slightly before coming to a stop. The driver's side window rolled down, and a middle-aged man leaned out, his face etched with concern. "What's going on? Are you okay?" he called out, his voice tinged with both worry and urgency. The girl ran to the car, her boots crunching against the snow-covered road. Her voice was shaky, almost lost in the storm's roar. "Please, sir, my mom. She's hurt. She fell in the forest. I can't wake her up. Please help me." Her words were a dagger to his heart. Without hesitation, the man unlocked the doors. "Get in. Show me where." She shook her head vehemently, her tiny hand pointing toward the shadowy edge of the forest. "She's not far. We have to go now." The man's instincts screamed at him to keep the girl safe in the car, but the urgency in her voice and the terror in her eyes left no room for argument. Grabbing his coat and a flashlight from the back seat, he stepped out into the storm. "Lead the way," he said firmly. The girl grabbed his hand, her icy fingers trembling as she pulled him toward the trees. Together, they plunged into the dark forest, the snow crunching beneath their hurried steps. Part 2. Through the shadows. The forest was an eerie contrast to the highway. The towering pines stood silent and unmoving, their branches heavy with snow. The wind hissed through the trees, and the only other sound was their labored breathing. The man's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the faint trail of footprints leading deeper into the woods. "How far is she?" the man asked, his voice strained. "Not far," the girl replied, though her breath came in ragged gasps. "She's just ahead." Minutes felt like hours as they pushed through the snow. The man's thoughts raced, a storm of fear and determination. He had no idea what state they would find her mother in, but he knew that time was their enemy. Hypothermia could claim a life in minutes in these conditions. Finally, the girl stopped, pointing ahead with a trembling hand. "There, she's there." The flashlight beam revealed a figure lying motionless in the snow, half covered by the storm's relentless assault. The man's heart sank as he rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the woman. Her face was pale, her lips tinged with blue, and her body felt as cold as the snow beneath her. "Stay calm," he said, more to himself than to the girl. He checked her pulse, his gloved fingers pressing gently against her neck. Relief surged through him when he felt the faintest flicker of life. "She's alive," he said, glancing at the girl. "But we have to move fast." The girl nodded, her wide eyes filled with hope and fear. The man worked quickly, wrapping the woman in a blanket he had brought and lifting her into his arms. She was impossibly light, her fragility a stark reminder of how dire the situation was. Stay close to me, he told the girl as they retraced their steps through the forest. Each step was a battle against the storm, but the man refused to slow. The weight of the woman in his arms was a small price to pay if it meant saving her life. Part 3. The Drive to Hope. Back at the car, the man carefully laid the woman across the back seat, tucking the blanket securely around her. He turned to the girl, who stood shivering beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. "Get in," he said gently. "We'll get her to the hospital." The girl climbed into the front seat, curling into a ball as the car's heater fought to chase away the cold. The man started the engine, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. The storm was unrelenting. The road ahead a treacherous blur of ice and snow, but there was no turning back. The drive was harrowing. The car skidded more than once, and visibility was almost non-existent. The man's heart pounded as he navigated the treacherous roads, his mind a constant calculation of time and distance. Every second felt like an eternity. "Will she be okay?" the girl asked, her voice small and hesitant. The man glanced at her, offering a reassuring smile despite the storm raging inside him. "She's strong, and you were brave to find help. That's what's going to save her." Finally, after what felt like hours, the glowing lights of the hospital came into view. Relief washed over the man as he pulled up to the emergency entrance. Nurses and doctors were already waiting, alerted by a call he had managed to make during the drive. The medical team acted swiftly, lifting the woman onto a stretcher and rushing her inside. The girl and the man followed, their boots crunching on the icy ground. Part 4. The Light Beyond the Storm. Inside the warm hospital, the contrast was almost overwhelming. The girl's pale cheeks began to regain color, and the man felt the first stirrings of hope. Minutes stretched into an eternity as they waited for news. Finally, a doctor approached, his expression calm and reassuring. "She's stable," he said. "She was suffering from hypothermia and severe exhaustion, but you brought her in time. She'll recover." The girl's face lit up with joy, and tears spilled down her cheeks as she smiled for the first time. She turned to the man, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you for saving my mom." The man knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You were the one who saved her. You were brave enough to call for help and strong enough to lead me to her. She's lucky to have you." As the man left the hospital that night, the storm began to subside. The wind calmed, and the first stars peeked through the thinning clouds. The world was still blanketed in snow, but the worst had passed. This act of kindness, of bravery and compassion in the face of adversity, was a powerful reminder of the good that exists in humanity. It was a testament to the strength found in connection, the courage in helping a stranger, and the resilience of the human spirit. Let this story be a beacon of hope. Even in the darkest storms, a single act of kindness can light the way. A path through the unknown. The forest loomed like a wall of shadows, its depths shrouded in an eerie silence beneath the storm's howl. The trees, ancient and imposing, were bent under the weight of thick snow, their branches creaking with the occasional groan. The girl, despite her small frame and trembling limbs, led the way with determined urgency. She moved as if she knew every root and hollow beneath the thick blanket of white. The man followed closely, his flashlight sweeping through the darkness. Every step was a battle against the biting cold and the deep snow that swallowed his boots. The flashlight beam illuminated fleeting glimpses of the forest, gnarled trunks, icy branches, and the occasional flicker of snowflakes dancing in the light. Each flicker seemed to mock him, highlighting the fragility of their mission. "What's your name?" the man asked, hoping to distract the girl from the fear etched on her face. "Lena," she answered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "My mom. She said she'd be okay. But she didn't get up." Her voice cracked, and she sniffled, brushing away tears with the back of her hand. "It's okay, Lena," the man reassured her, even though his own heart was heavy with dread. "We'll get her to safety. Just keep moving forward." Lena nodded, her small figure forging ahead despite the storm's fury. The man marveled at her courage. She was just a child, yet she had braved the blizzard and the wilderness. Driven by love and desperation, her determination fueled his own resolve. Suddenly, Lena stopped in her tracks. She pointed ahead to a faint outline barely visible in the gloom. There. She's there. The man squinted, adjusting the flashlight's beam. Sure enough, a huddled figure lay motionless in the snow. The sight sent a chill through him far colder than the storm. They hurried forward, Lena running ahead as fast as her legs could carry her. The woman lay crumpled against the base of a tree, her body almost camouflaged beneath a thin layer of snow. She wore a woolen hat pulled low over her face, and her scarf was stiff with frost. The man knelt beside her, his breath clouding the frigid air as he brushed away the snow from her face. "Mom, wake up," Lena cried, falling to her knees beside her mother. She shook her gently, her small hands trembling. The man checked the woman's pulse, his fingers searching for any sign of life. Relief flooded through him when he felt the faintest beat beneath her cold skin. She was alive, but barely. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale and icy to the touch. "She's alive, Lena," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "But we need to move quickly. She can't stay in this cold any longer." "What's wrong with her?" Lena asked, her eyes wide with fear. "She's hypothermic," the man explained. "Her body's too cold, and it's shutting down to protect itself. But we're not too late. We can still save her." He worked quickly, wrapping the woman in a thick blanket he had carried from the car. Every movement was calculated, every second precious. He lifted her gently, cradling her fragile body in his arms. She felt impossibly light, as if the cold had drained her of strength and substance. "Stay close to me, Lena," he said as he rose to his feet. The girl nodded, her eyes glued to her mother as she followed closely. The journey back to the car was even more grueling than the trek into the forest. The weight of the woman in his arms slowed the man's progress, and the storm seemed determined to thwart their efforts. The wind howled louder, flinging snow into their faces and obscuring their path. Lena stumbled more than once, but each time she pushed herself back up, her eyes never leaving her mother. Her resolve was unshakable, and her courage inspired the man to keep going, even as his legs burned with effort and the cold seeped through his thick coat. "You're doing great, Lena," he said, his voice firm and encouraging. "We're almost there." The girl nodded, her breaths coming in sharp bursts. "Mom's going to be okay, right?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope and fear. "She's going to be okay," he replied, though his heart ached with uncertainty. He had to believe it, for Lena's sake and his own. Finally, the edge of the forest came into view. The man's car was barely visible through the swirling snow, its headlights dim but steady. Relief surged through him, lending strength to his tired limbs. "We made it," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "We made it, Lena." As they reached the car, the man carefully placed the woman in the back seat, wrapping her securely in the blanket to retain whatever warmth she still had. Lena climbed into the front passenger seat, curling into a ball as the car's heater sputtered to life. The man took one last look at the forest, its shadowy depths now fading into the storm. He had never believed in fate or divine intervention, but something about this night felt extraordinary. Perhaps it was the girl's unwavering courage or the desperate hope that had driven her to stand alone on that highway. Whatever it was, he knew it had brought them here for a reason. Sliding into the driver's seat, he gripped the wheel tightly. The storm showed no signs of relenting, but his determination was stronger than the blizzard's fury. "Hold on," he said, glancing in the rearview mirror at the woman. Then, turning to Lena, he added, "We're getting your mom to safety. She's going to be okay." The road ahead was treacherous, but the man felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't just driving through a storm. He was driving toward salvation. Unbeknownst to them, the act of kindness and courage they had shared was already reshaping their lives, and the lesson it carried would ripple far beyond the snowy woods. The road to salvation. The car groaned to life, its engine struggling against the storm's relentless grip. Snow piled on the windshield faster than the wipers could clear it, reducing visibility to mere feet. The man's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes darting between the road and the unconscious woman in the rearview mirror. The girl, Lena, sat beside him, her knees pulled tightly to her chest. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned toward the heater, her eyes fixed on her mother. She was silent, but the unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Would they make it in time? "I need you to stay calm, Lena," the man said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We're going to get her help. She's strong, and so are you." Lena nodded, her small hands clutching the edges of her coat. "She always says we'll be okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Even when we don't have enough food or when it gets too cold in the caravan. She says it's all going to be okay." The man glanced at her, his chest tightening. Her words painted a picture of a life fraught with struggle, yet somehow resilient. He wondered what kind of strength it took for a mother to keep hope alive for her child in the face of such hardships. The storm howled louder, shaking the car as it crawled along the snow-covered highway. The road was a treacherous expanse of ice, and every turn felt like a gamble. The man's mind raced, calculating the distance to the hospital. He knew the odds were stacked against them. The woman's condition was critical, and every passing second weighed heavily on him. As they approached a sharp curve, the car's tires slipped on the icy surface. The vehicle skidded sideways, the headlights casting erratic beams across the blizzard. Lena gasped, clutching the dashboard as the man fought to regain control. His hands moved instinctively, steering into the skid and easing off the brakes. The car straightened, its tires gripping the road just in time. "You're doing great," he said, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through him. "We're going to get through this." Lena's wide eyes met his, a flicker of trust softening her fear. "You're not scared." He chuckled softly, though his heart was racing. "Oh, I'm scared. But being scared doesn't mean we stop. It means we keep going, no matter what." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and for the first time, she seemed to relax, if only a little. The journey felt like an eternity. The man's eyes burned from the strain of squinting through the storm, and his fingers ached from gripping the wheel so tightly. He glanced at the rearview mirror every few seconds, checking on the woman. Her breathing was shallow, but it was there, a fragile thread of life holding on. "Do you have a name?" Lena asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was tentative, as if she wasn't sure whether it was okay to ask. The man smiled faintly. "It's David, but you can call me whatever you like." Lena tilted her head, her dark eyes studying him. "Thank you, Mr. David, for helping us." "You don't need to thank me," he said, his tone firm yet gentle. "You're the one who stood out there in the storm. You're the reason we're going to save your mom." Lena didn't respond, but her gaze softened. She turned back to the window, watching the endless white swirl past. Finally, after what felt like hours, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. The hospital's emergency lights cut through the blizzard like a beacon, guiding them toward salvation. Relief surged through David, but he didn't let his guard down. The road leading to the hospital was still treacherous, and he couldn't afford any mistakes. As they neared the entrance, David honked the horn, alerting the medical staff who had been notified during their perilous drive. A group of nurses and doctors emerged, their figures bundled against the cold, pushing a stretcher through the snow. David brought the car to a halt and jumped out, opening the back door with a sense of urgency. "She's hypothermic," he said as they approached, his voice firm but calm. "She's been out in the cold for too long." The nurses worked quickly, carefully transferring the woman onto the stretcher and wrapping her in layers of thermal blankets. Lena scrambled out of the car, following closely behind. She reached for her mother's hand, but a nurse gently guided her away. "We need to get her inside right away," the nurse explained, her tone kind but firm. "You can come in and wait where it's warm." Lena hesitated, her eyes darting between her mother and David. He crouched to her level, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "They're going to take good care of her," he said. "You've done everything you could. Now it's their turn." Tears welled in Lena's eyes, but she nodded. She clung to David's hand as they followed the medical team into the hospital. The warmth of hope. Inside, the warmth was almost overwhelming. Lena's cheeks, once pale and frostbitten, began to flush with color. David guided her to a seat in the waiting area, handing her a cup of hot chocolate offered by a nurse. She cradled it in her hands, staring at the steam as it rose into the air. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. David watched as Lena's exhaustion began to take hold. Her eyelids drooped, but she fought to stay awake, her gaze fixed on the hallway where her mother had been taken. Finally, a doctor approached, his face calm and reassuring. "She's stable," he said, his voice gentle. "She was suffering from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, but you got her here in time. She'll need rest and monitoring, but she's going to recover." The words hit Lena like a wave of relief. Her face broke into a smile, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you." She turned to David, her voice trembling. "You saved her." David knelt beside her, his eyes kind. "No, Lena, you saved her. You were the one who didn't give up, even when it was hard." Lena threw her arms around him, her small frame trembling with gratitude and emotion. For the first time since the ordeal began, the weight on her tiny shoulders seemed to lift. As David left the hospital that night, the storm had finally begun to subside. The stars peeked through the thinning clouds, casting their light on the snow-covered world. He paused for a moment, gazing up at the sky. Sometimes, he thought, the smallest acts of courage and kindness could ripple into something extraordinary. Lena's bravery and his willingness to stop had changed the course of a life. It was a reminder of the quiet power of human connection, a lesson he would carry with him forever. A new dawn, the hospital's sterile warmth, and the muffled hum of activity created a surreal contrast to the storm that had engulfed them just hours before. Lena sat quietly in the waiting room, her small hands wrapped around the hot chocolate the nurses had given her. The steam curled upward, and she stared at it as if trying to read her future in its ephemeral spirals. David sat beside her, his body aching from the night's ordeal, but his heart was too restless for fatigue to take hold. He glanced at Lena, her shoulders hunched and her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway where her mother had disappeared. "Do you want to sit closer to the room?" David asked gently. Lena shook her head. "They said we can't go in yet," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "But what if she needs me?" David leaned forward, meeting her worried gaze. "She's in the best hands now," he said. "The doctors are taking care of her. And you've already done the hardest part. You brought her this far. That's something most people wouldn't have been brave enough to do." Lena's lip trembled, but she nodded. "She always takes care of me. I couldn't just leave her there." David's chest tightened. Her words spoke to a kind of resilience he rarely saw, especially in someone so young. It was clear that the bond between Lena and her mother was unshakable, forged in the fires of hardship, and sustained by mutual love. As they sat in silence, the storm outside finally began to abate. The relentless howling of the wind quieted, and the glow of emergency lights outside the hospital windows became softer, less urgent. For the first time, David could see beyond the snow to the dark silhouettes of nearby buildings and trees. A doctor's update. The hours passed slowly, each tick of the clock a reminder of how fragile the situation was. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension. A doctor emerged from the hallway, his expression calm and composed. "Are you Lena?" he asked, kneeling slightly to meet her eye level. Lena stood quickly, clutching her cup of hot chocolate like a lifeline. "Yes. Is my mom okay?" The doctor smiled gently. She's stable now. She was suffering from severe hypothermia and exhaustion, but you brought her here in time. She's very lucky. We've warmed her up and started her on fluids to help her recover her strength. She's resting, but you can see her soon." Relief flooded Lena's face, her eyes welling with tears. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. She turned to David, her small hands reaching for his. "We did it. She's going to be okay." David squeezed her hands, his own relief palpable. "You did it, Lena. You saved her." The doctor added, "Your mother's very strong, and it's clear she raised a strong daughter. It's not easy to make it through something like this." Lena's face lit up with a shy smile, but her gratitude was evident. "Can I see her now?" she asked eagerly. The doctor nodded. "Just for a little while. She needs rest, but I think seeing you will help her recover even faster." A reunion in warmth. David followed Lena as the doctor led them down the hallway. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the walls, but the atmosphere felt softer now, filled with the promise of recovery. They entered a small room where Lena's mother lay, propped up on a bed with warm blankets tucked around her. Her face was still pale, but there was a hint of color returning to her cheeks. "Mom!" Lena cried, rushing to her side. She climbed onto the chair beside the bed, carefully taking her mother's hand. Her mother's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her daughter's voice. For a moment, confusion clouded her expression, but it quickly gave way to recognition and relief. "Lena," she whispered, her voice hoarse but full of love. "You're okay." Lena nodded fervently, her tears spilling over. "I found help, Mom. Mr. David helped us. You're going to be okay now." Her mother's gaze shifted to David, and her eyes softened with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving us." David stepped closer, his voice warm but humble. Lena did most of the work. She didn't give up, even when things were at their worst. She's the real hero. Her mother smiled weakly, her fingers tightening around Lena's hand. "She's always been my little fighter." The room was quiet for a moment, the only sound the soft beeping of the monitors. It wasn't the silence of fear or despair. It was the peaceful stillness that comes when a crisis has passed, leaving behind only gratitude and the promise of healing. The aftermath of kindness. When David stepped outside the hospital later that night, the world had transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that shimmered under the glow of streetlights. The air was crisp and still, and the stars above twinkled like tiny beacons in the clear sky. He paused for a moment, taking it all in. The events of the night played back in his mind. The desperation in Lena's eyes, the bitter cold of the forest, the fragile hope they had carried with them through the storm. It was a night that had changed him in ways he didn't yet fully understand. As he made his way to his car, David felt a tug on his sleeve. He turned to see Lena standing behind him, bundled in a hospital blanket. "Mr. David," she said softly. He knelt down so they were eye level. "What is it, Lena?" "I just wanted to say, I think you're my hero too," she said, her cheeks reddening. "If you hadn't stopped my mom, she might not have made it." David felt a lump form in his throat, but he managed to smile. Sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to stop and help. "But you're the one who made it happen, Lena. Don't ever forget how strong you are." She threw her arms around him, holding on tightly. David hugged her back, his heart full. As Lena returned to the hospital, David stood by his car for a moment longer, gazing at the clear sky. He had always believed that the world could be cold and unkind, much like the storm they had just endured. But tonight had reminded him of something far more powerful, the quiet strength of compassion and the courage it takes to act. As he drove away, the first light of dawn began to break on the horizon, painting the snow-covered world in soft hues of pink and gold. It was a new day, filled with hope, and a reminder that even in the harshest storms, the smallest acts of kindness could illuminate the path forward. The ripple effect. David awoke the next morning to the faint light of dawn filtering through his curtains. The events of the previous night still lingered vividly in his mind, their weight both heavy and uplifting. He couldn't shake the image of Lena's small figure braving the storm, nor the quiet gratitude in her mother's eyes as she held her daughter's hand. He sat up, stretching stiffly, and glanced at his phone. A notification blinked on the screen, a message from the hospital. It was from one of the nurses he had spoken to before leaving the previous night. "Mother and daughter are doing well this morning. Lena wanted us to let you know her mom says thank you again. If you'd like, they'd love to see you." David stared at the message for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He wasn't sure what he expected after last night. A quiet return to his routine, perhaps, but the idea of visiting them felt right. The connection they had forged in the chaos of the storm was one he didn't want to abandon. A visit to remember. Later that morning, David walked through the hospital's automatic doors, carrying a small bouquet of winter flowers. The lobby buzzed with quiet activity, and the warmth inside was a welcome contrast to the chill outside. He asked for Lena and her mother at the front desk, and a kind nurse escorted him to their room. When he entered, he saw Lena sitting cross-legged on the hospital bed, her cheeks glowing with newfound warmth. Her mother, propped up on a pile of pillows, looked much better than she had the night before. Her color had returned, and though she still appeared tired, there was a spark of life in her eyes. "Mr. David," Lena exclaimed, hopping off the bed and rushing to greet him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her small frame radiating gratitude. David crouched down, holding out the flowers. "Good morning, Lena. I thought you and your mom might like these." Lena beamed, taking the bouquet carefully. "They're beautiful. Thank you." Her mother smiled softly from the bed, her voice warm but tinged with weariness. "David, I can't thank you enough. What you did for us, it's something I'll never forget." David pulled a chair closer to her bedside, his tone humble. "You don't have to thank me. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." The woman shook her head gently. "No, it's more than that. A lot of people drove past Lena last night. You were the only one who stopped. That decision saved my life." Stories of resilience. As the morning stretched on, their conversation deepened. David learned that Lena and her mother, Sarah, lived a transient life in a small caravan parked on the outskirts of town. Sarah worked odd jobs to make ends meet, and though their life was far from easy, they had always found a way to get by. "That storm caught us off guard," Sarah explained, her voice soft. "We were walking back to the caravan when I slipped on the ice. I hit my head, and everything went black after that. Lena told me she tried to wake me up, but when I didn't move, she ran to the road to find help." David glanced at Lena, who was listening quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "You're braver than most adults I know," he said, his tone filled with admiration. Lena shrugged shyly, a small smile playing on her lips. "I was just scared. I didn't want to lose my mom." "That kind of love is what keeps people going," David replied. "And it's what brought you both here safely." A seed of change. As their conversation continued, an idea began to form in David's mind. The storm had brought them together, but it also highlighted something he couldn't ignore: the fragility of their situation. Sarah and Lena were resilient, but they shouldn't have to face such dangers alone. He wondered if there was more he could do. "I know this might sound forward," he began, his voice careful, "but have you ever thought about finding a more stable place to live? Somewhere safer, especially for Lena?" Sarah sighed, her expression tinged with a mix of hope and hesitation. "Of course I've thought about it, but it's not that simple. Money's always been tight, and moving means starting over again." David nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "What if I could help? Not just with a handout, but with a plan. I work with a nonprofit that helps families like yours find housing and job opportunities. It's not an instant fix, but it could be a fresh start." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of pity or judgment. She found none, only sincerity. "You'd do that for us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David smiled gently. "You're not just anyone, Sarah. You and Lena have shown me what true strength looks like. If there's a way to help you build a safer, more secure life, I want to be part of that." Lena's face lit up with excitement. "Does that mean we won't have to move all the time? And maybe I can go to school like other kids?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to squeeze David's hand. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You've already done so much." "You don't have to thank me," David replied. "Just promise me one thing. When you're in a position to help someone else someday, you'll do it. That's how we keep the kindness going." A new chapter. Over the next few weeks, David worked tirelessly with his nonprofit contacts to find a way forward for Sarah and Lena. With their help, Sarah secured a small apartment in town, along with a part-time job that allowed her to care for Lena while building a more stable foundation. Lena, for the first time in her life, enrolled in school. On her first day, David was there to see her off, standing beside Sarah as the little girl waved from the steps of the bus. Her smile was radiant, full of hope and promise. Sarah turned to David, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know where we'd be if you hadn't stopped that night." David looked out at the horizon, where the sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "Sometimes it's not about where you've been," he said. "It's about where you're going. And you and Lena are heading somewhere incredible." As the bus disappeared down the street, David knew that the storm that had brought them together was more than just a moment of crisis. It was the beginning of a journey, one born of courage, kindness, and the unshakable belief that even the smallest actions could create ripples that changed lives forever. Ripples beyond the storm. The weeks turned into months, and the memory of the storm that had brought them together transformed into something more than just a tale of survival. For David, Sarah, and Lena, it became a shared foundation, a reminder that kindness, when embraced with courage, could rewrite destinies. Lena was thriving in school, her boundless curiosity and energy making her a favorite among her teachers and peers. Each morning, she would wave goodbye to Sarah and step onto the school bus with a sense of joy that had once been foreign to her life. Sarah, in turn, was finding her footing. The stability of a steady job and a warm home gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. Yet even as they settled into their new life, none of them forgot the bond they shared with David. A community united. David's work with the nonprofit deepened in the aftermath of the storm. The encounter with Lena and Sarah had ignited a renewed sense of purpose within him. He began advocating more fiercely for families in precarious situations, sharing their story, not as a tale of charity, but as an example of resilience and hope. One evening, while attending a community meeting about housing insecurity, David shared the story of the night he met Lena. "Sometimes all it takes is stopping," he said, his voice steady and filled with conviction. "In that moment, you don't need to know how to fix everything. You just need to care enough to try." That little girl stood in the storm, braver than anyone I've ever met, because she believed someone would stop. We need to be that someone. His words struck a chord. By the end of the meeting, several attendees approached him, eager to help. Some volunteered their time, others offered resources, and a few even pledged financial support. The momentum grew, and within months, David's nonprofit launched a new initiative, the Storm Shelter Project, aimed at providing emergency aid and long-term support to families in crisis. Lena's ripple. Lena, too, carried the lessons of that night forward. Despite her young age, she had an uncanny ability to empathize with others. She often stayed after school to help her classmates with their homework or volunteered at community events with Sarah. Her teachers were amazed by her kindness and maturity, often remarking that she was wise beyond her years. One day, during a school assembly, the principal announced a writing contest on the theme of heroes. Lena's hand shot up eagerly. That evening, She sat at the small kitchen table in their apartment, scribbling furiously in her notebook. When the day of the contest arrived, Lena stood nervously on stage, clutching her paper. Her essay, titled "The Man Who Stopped," brought the audience to tears. "My hero isn't someone who fights dragons or flies in the sky," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "He's someone who didn't drive past. He's someone who saw a scared little girl in a storm and said, 'I'll help you.' My hero taught me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right, even when it's hard." The room erupted in applause, and Lena's essay won first prize. Her story was later published in the local newspaper, where it caught the attention of even more people who wanted to get involved with David's nonprofit. A reunion and a promise. On the 1-year anniversary of the storm, David, Sarah, and Lena gathered for a small celebration. They met at a park near the apartment complex where Sarah and Lena now lived, a place filled with trees that swayed gently in the crisp autumn breeze. Lena ran ahead, her laughter ringing out as she chased the falling leaves. Sarah and David watched her, their smiles warm with shared pride. "She's a different child now," Sarah said, her voice soft. "She has hope. And so do I." David nodded. "She's incredible. But so are you. You've given her so much to look forward to." Sarah turned to him, her eyes glistening. "I wouldn't be here without you, David. What you did for us, it's more than I can ever repay." "You've already repaid me," he said, gesturing toward Lena, who was now gathering leaves to make a pile. "Seeing her happy, seeing you both safe. That's all the thanks I need." They spent the afternoon together, sharing stories and laughter. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lena ran up to David, her hands clutching a small, carefully wrapped package. "This is for you, Mr. David," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. David opened it to find a simple but beautiful drawing. It showed the three of them standing together in the snow, with a car in the background and a glowing light in the distance. Above it, in Lena's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for stopping." David felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at Lena. "This is the best gift anyone's ever given me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Lena smiled, her eyes sparkling. "It's to remind you that you're a hero too." The endless ripple. In the years that followed, the effects of that fateful night continued to unfold. The Storm Shelter Project expanded to neighboring towns, helping hundreds of families rebuild their lives. Lena grew into a bright, compassionate young woman, often volunteering with the nonprofit that had once helped her and her mother. She became a living testament to the idea that a single act of kindness could transform not just one life, but countless others. For David, the storm was no longer a memory of hardship. It was a reminder of the power of connection. Every time he told their story, he saw its impact in the faces of those who listened. And every time he saw Lena, thriving and full of hope, he was reminded that sometimes the greatest heroes aren't those who seek to change the world. They're the ones who stop to help. And so the ripples of that storm spread outward, touching lives far beyond what any of them could have imagined. What began as a moment of desperation became a legacy of hope, proving that even in the harshest storms, humanity's light can shine the brightest. The light beyond the storm. Years passed, and the once turbulent night of the storm became a cherished memory, a pivotal moment that connected three lives in an unbreakable bond. For David, Sarah, and Lena, it wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of transformation, courage, and the enduring power of kindness. Lena, now a young adult, stood in the crowd of a bustling community event. She was no longer the frightened girl who had braved a storm to save her mother. Instead, she had grown into a poised and compassionate woman who dedicated her life to helping others. As a speaker at the event, she shared her story, not with the intent of dwelling on her own hardship, but to inspire others. In that moment, Lena said to the crowd, "I was just a little girl hoping someone would care enough to stop. And one man did. He didn't ask who I was or whether helping me would inconvenience him. He simply saw someone in need and chose to act. That choice didn't just save my mother's life, it shaped the course of mine. David, sitting quietly in the back of the crowd, listened with pride. He had watched Lena blossom into someone who carried forward the lessons they had all learned that night. That compassion is a choice, courage is contagious, and even the smallest acts of kindness can leave the greatest impact. The lessons of the storm. The journey they had shared offered lessons that resonated far beyond their own lives. It taught them, and others, that kindness requires action. It's easy to feel sympathy for someone in need, but true kindness lies in taking action, even when it's inconvenient or uncertain. David's decision to stop that night showed how one choice could ripple outward to transform lives. Courage is found in connection. Lena's bravery in facing the storm wasn't just her own. It was fueled by her love for her mother and her belief that someone would help. Courage doesn't exist in isolation. It grows when we connect with others and believe in the goodness of humanity. Hope can be rekindled. For Sarah, the storm was a turning point that brought not only physical safety, but also the hope she needed to rebuild her life. It reminded her that even in the darkest times, there is a path forward if we open ourselves to help. Every small act matters, whether it was Lena standing on the highway, David stopping his car, or the community rallying behind them. Every action played a role in their story. No gesture is too small to make a difference. A legacy of kindness. As the event ended and the crowd dispersed, David approached Lena and Sarah, who were now surrounded by people offering congratulations and encouragement. When Lena spotted him, her face lit up with the same warm smile he had seen on that snowy night so many years ago. "Mr. David," she said, her voice filled with gratitude and affection, "I hope you know none of this would have happened without you." David smiled, shaking his head gently. "It wasn't just me, Lena. You're the one who stood in that storm. You're the one who kept going when it seemed impossible. You're the reason this story exists." Sarah chimed in, her voice steady and warm. "You taught us that kindness isn't just about helping in the moment. It's about building something bigger. And that's what you've done for us." David looked at them both, his heart full. "What we built together. And now you're passing it on. That's what matters." The final lesson. As David walked home that evening, the cool breeze stirred memories of that fateful storm. He paused to look up at the clear night sky, the stars shining brightly above him. He thought about how life often places us at crossroads, giving us the chance to make choices that define not only our lives, but the lives of others. The storm that night was a reminder of how interconnected we all are. None of us exists in isolation. Our actions ripple outward, touching lives we may never even see. What begins as a small moment, a single decision to stop and help, can create a legacy of hope, resilience, and change. The lesson, he realized, was simple but profound. When faced with the storms of life, whether your own or someone else's, choose kindness. Choose to act. You never know how far the light you spark will travel. And with that thought, David smiled and walked into the quiet warmth of his home, content in the knowledge that one snowy night had not only saved lives, but illuminated a truth that would endure forever. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.